Yes. Whoa now, whoa now, whoa now. Kingdom rise and kingdom fall. Whoa yeah now. Babylon is against the wall. Babylon trying to find a solution. Whoa yeah now. Babylon is against the wall. Yeah. Whoa yeah now. It must fall, yeah. Only Jah can solve this problem. Babylon is against the wall. Babylon, you're trying to find a solution. Rise and kingdom fall. Babylon back is against the wall.
What if fairy tales are real tales and real tales are fairy tales? We already seen how some people on this earth could be categorized as werewolves. Some people on this earth could be categorized as elves. Today, we're going to see who the humans are. The humans.
But when we compare this Neanderthal DNA to various human populations, we see that African populations are kind of our baseline. They are the most distant from Neanderthals. They're 0% similarity to Neanderthals. Europeans are 1 to 3% more similar to Neanderthals than African populations are, and the same is true for East Asian populations and for Melanesian populations.
So apparently I have more Neanderthal DNA than 84% of other 23andMe customers. So like, has anyone looked into this? What does this even mean? Where are my Neanderthals at?
And when Homo sapiens arrived in Europe about 40,000 years ago, they encountered another group of humans, the Neanderthals.
If we want to really understand what makes humans unique, we need to compare ourselves not only to our closest living relatives, the apes in Africa, but to our very closest relatives, the Neanderthals.
I want to show you guys some of the documents showing the white races of Europe, and we can get a better perspective as to who the Moors were fighting. These are the albinos and the beasts of Europe, and the Moors were fighting these people for hundreds of years prior to the so-called transatlantic slave trade. And one interesting thing I wanted to show you is that when you look at these beasts and albinos and how they have achieved what they've been able to achieve in just a few hundred years, keeping in mind that they were considered wild men just a few hundred years ago, and they had no last names. Many of them didn't even have first names. And I wanted to show you this because I found this very interesting. If you see here the wild men, and you look at the clothing that the people are wearing to the left, you can see here they're wearing this clothing to cover up their hairy bodies. So I found that very interesting. And something else I found in the British Library was one of the oldest genealogy charts, one of the first ones made for white people. And as you can see at the bottom of that genealogy chart, you see 2 wild men. So they're showing that their ancestry comes from the caveman. So that should give you something to think about, considering that just a few hundred years later, today, we have people like the Queen of England who claim to be of the royal bloodline of Egyptians and Cushites who ruled the earth. They even found the remains of a boy who was buried at Stonehenge in Europe. He was buried in Europe, but he actually came from the Mediterranean Sea in Africa. And he came to Europe 3,500 years ago. So that's in 1500 BC. So we're told that the Moors arrived in Europe in 700 AD. But here we have Black people out of Africa coming to Europe over 2,000 years before the Moors arrived in 700 AD.
If Neanderthals and modern humans had interbred successfully, traces of their DNA would be found in ours. Most scientists, Pablo included, thought this highly unlikely. When different species mate, their offspring are usually infertile.
I was biased against interbreeding. There's no evidence for it, so I don't think it really happened.
But with the Neanderthal genome now sequenced, Pablo and his team could examine this question. The first step was to map the individual genomes of 5 people from different ethnic groups. Then they compared this modern DNA with Neanderthal. They focused only on small specific regions called variable areas, where the order of the DNA letters often differs from one individual to the next. Here, if interbreeding had taken place, letter sequences typical of Neanderthal DNA would show up in the human DNA strand. But with no interbreeding, there would be no trace of Neanderthal DNA in the variable areas. Pablo expected to see the same negative result in the genomes of all 5 modern humans, regardless of ethnic group.
Well, if Neanderthals are equally distantly related to everybody, then Neanderthal should match the French guy and the West African guy equally often.
But that is not what they found.
When we compared one African to a European individual, the Neanderthal matched the European individual more often than the African one.
The result indicated that Neanderthals were genetically closer to Europeans and Asians than they were to Africans. It meant that somewhere along the line, European and Asian humans had picked up Neanderthal DNA.
So that was sort of quite shaking to me. I thought this must be a statistical fluke. It was not quite significant. This will surely go away when we have more data.
So Pablo told his team to do the work again, and again, and again.
We really needed to make it absolutely sure that we were right.
We started to look at the problem from different angles. And every time we would ask the question in a little bit different way, the answer would come back, it's Neanderthal. We were able to convince one another and eventually the world that we have a little bit of Neanderthal ancestry in modern human genomes.
The amount of Neanderthal DNA in these modern genomes is small, between just 1% and 4%. But the implications are staggering. After migrating out of Africa, early humans must have mated with Neanderthals and produced fertile offspring who inherited segments of Neanderthal DNA.
What we have shown clearly is that we could interbreed with them, we could have fertile children, and at least some of these children became incorporated in the human community and reproduced and contributed to present-day humans.
Pablo's groundbreaking research forces a radical shift in perspective regarding Neanderthals. They were genetically close enough to have children with our species. They probably also had language. And there are yet more revelations. As archaeologists re-examine previously discounted evidence in favor of Neanderthals' skills and abilities.
Now for a discovery which may surprise you. Scientists have found that most of us still have a little bit of a Neanderthal inside us. A study into the DNA of the human subspecies found that they interbred with modern humans tens of thousands of years ago, and their genetic mark remains today. The BBC's Palab Ghosh has more on these extraordinary findings.
60,000 years ago, our ancestors emerged from Africa. They dispersed across the globe to form the other races of the world we have today. As they left, they encountered another kind of human, much like us, the Neanderthals. This is a skull of a modern human, and this is from a Neanderthal. Look closely and you can see that this one has a slightly longer brain case. Most scientists believe that these are two separate species, and there wasn't much interaction between the two. But now we know there was interbreeding, and that all non-Africans living today are part Neanderthal. The researchers extracted DNA from Neanderthal fossils and compared it with that taken from people living today. They found that the DNA of Europeans and Asians is 2% Neanderthal.
It's a very exciting discovery because it gives us really the first strong evidence that there was interbreeding with people like the Neanderthals. And it means that modern humans in different parts of the world may have slightly different mixes of modernity and these more primitive genes.
Further analysis should give a greater insight into how Neanderthals lived and shed more light on our own early origins. Palab Ghosh, BBC News.
And the Neanderthal in me has always said Neanderthal. I stand quite corrected.
There are many jokes about people behaving like Neanderthals, but it seems the joke could be on us. Research has found that many human beings actually have Neanderthal DNA, proving there's an evolutionary link.
The Neanderthal, that beastly evolutionary outcast, thought to be extinct for 30,000 years. But scientists believe they've picked up the trail of that hairy historic reject in the most surprising of places.
In us, many of us anyway, there is new evidence that humans inherited up to 4% of our DNA from Neanderthals.
The study in the journal Science is based on painstaking research into 3 Neanderthal bone fragments. Scientists reconstructed the Neanderthal genetic code and compared it to modern humans from across the globe, and found there was up to a 4% match with humans everywhere but from Africa. The theory is that our human ancestors migrating out of Africa some 70,000 years ago had some amorous encounters with Neanderthals somewhere in the Middle East.
We mean that they interbred or they had sex.
This is the first real evidence Neanderthals and humans had kids, which means, despite the old assumption that Neanderthals disappeared from the evolutionary chart,
Neanderthals aren't quite extinct. They all live on a little bit in many of us.
The research is part of a major project mapping the Neanderthal's genome and hopefully providing firm answers to a number of evolutionary questions.
If you've ever accused someone of being a Neanderthal, then tonight you've been proved right. But it takes one to know one, because scientists have just released studies that show we are all partly Neanderthal. For the first time ever, DNA analysis has proved that early modern humans interbred with our closest evolutionary relatives. Stephanie West has this report.
It's a debate that's engaged scientists for 100 years or more. What's our link with Neanderthal man and woman, and moreover, did we ever mate? Now the truth is out of the box. According to research released tonight, DNA evidence shows modern humans interbred with Neanderthal.
People like me have argued that there might have been interbreeding in the past, but all trace of it could have disappeared. This shows it didn't disappear, and it's there at a reasonable level.
For the last 4 years, a team of 50 international scientists in Germany have been extracting DNA from Neanderthal bones, looking to resurrect their genetic code. But in so doing, they found this new evidence that settled the long-standing debate. Scientists found DNA evidence they began interbreeding at least 50,000 years before Neanderthals became extinct. As to what these scientists say, it's a potential goal to help establish what makes us unique. In fact, in modern times, Neanderthal has become a handy word for brutish, unevolved behaviour, as in this 1950s cult classic. But at the Natural History Museum, they hope this discovery will lead to a little more understanding towards our past partners.
What we don't know yet is what these genes might be doing. So the genes that came from Neanderthals, we don't yet know what their significance might be. They were distinct from us, but they were actually quite advanced humans. They could walk upright as well as we can. Their brains were as large as ours. They were pretty good at what they did in terms of stone tool making. They buried their dead, so they had some very human features. And what this research also shows is that there are at least 70 genes that have been picked up that seem to be unique to the modern human line.
Before disappearing from the face of the Earth 28,000 years ago, Neanderthals shared a common offspring with Cro-Magnon man, an early Homo sapien. They hunted the same territories and lived through the same dangers in a cohabitation that lasted for 10,000 years. Neanderthal appeared 400,000 years ago in a region stretching from the Middle East to Europe. 300,000 years later, Homo sapien crossed paths.
How is this discovery significant?
Well, it's a major scientific advance. If a few years ago somebody would have told me that we would be able to obtain the complete nuclear genome of an extinct species of human, I would not have believed it at all. But it happened. And what's important to understand is that beyond the study of the Neanderthals themselves, this discovery is important to understand the very nature of modern humans. We can really understand what makes modern humans really different from the other living beings.
Is it possible to say, though, what is Neanderthal about us? How has Neanderthal DNA sort of impacted modern humans?
Well, first of all, the study showed that this integration of genetic material is visible only in non-Africans, in Asians and Europeans, and this is related to the way this crossing between the two species occurred. But it's very limited. It's between 1% and 4%, and it's very important to understand that out of the 3.5 billion base pairs, which are the coding of our DNA, only 3% are really what geneticists call genes. But what we know is that we have some genes in modern humans which are different from what is found in Neanderthals.
Jean-Jacques Blin, let me stop you there because I want to turn to Dimitri Karadimas now. Now, you're an anthropologist, so you're looking at this from a slightly different angle, but how do you think that this discovery could impact the way that we look at ourselves and our origins?
Yes, I think it's quite interesting. It's fascinating, just because we had this idea that we could be a completely pure species. In that, I mean that Homo sapiens could be something completely different from the other hominids that exist. Now, if the result that is bring to us shows that actually for a part of the actual humans we have some elements coming from the Neanderthal genes, so it will be interesting because we cannot go on with the idea that we are a complete pure species. Mm-hmm. So we have something common with another one.
So there's a lot more than just science in all of this and sort of how Neanderthal DNA is impacting us. It's also how to do with our own self-image.
Really, this is going to sound silly, but this is really important. Cutting-edge genetics. One of the areas I'm really lucky I'm blessed to work in 3 distinct areas of biology: immunology, genetics, and reproduction. And on the genetic side, I get to go to conferences and hear about advances in genetics in all species. And I was just at one a couple of weeks ago down at the Cold Spring Harbor Lab in Long Island, and I learned a bit about what's being known about the genome of Neanderthals, the genetic makeup of Neanderthals. And the genome sequencers, led by Svante Pabo, who works in Germany, has taken tiny little fragments of Neanderthal bones, isolated DNA, and determined the genome of the Neanderthal, and used that information to determine, using genetic methods, how long ago Neanderthals and humans were a single species, where the common ancestor was. They've also been able to compare human genomes and ask the question of whether there's any evidence of Neanderthal genes in the human genome. And they've found that there is. And the amount is quite significant, upwards of 5 to 7%. Neanderthals used to live in the Neander Valley. You could have called it the Cayuga Lake Basin, but that's where they lived. And out of Africa came the modern humans, and the word the geneticist uses, admixed. They admixed with the Neanderthals. And they all used to live in caves in those days like this. Came out of Africa, admixed with the Neanderthals. This was Neanderthal territory. There was another group of Neanderthal-like creatures called the Denisovans. They lived up here in Siberia, and they have their genome has been sequenced. They were distinct from the Neanderthals. And so you can find in people of European and Asian ancestry evidence of about 7%, 5 to 10% of your genome is common with that of Neanderthals. We've been separated from them for 30,000 years or so. And in some of the tribes in Papua New Guinea and those islands out there, there's evidence for a different kind of genome, which is probably the Denisovan genome. And they might have 7% Neanderthal and 5% Denisovan. So they might be 12 or 15% different from us. And in fact, the Africans who came out from Africa have no evidence of any Neanderthal genes in them. No evidence of admixture. So they're the real pure humans. Homo sapiens. Really, really interesting, and it gives you a lot to think about. Right.